Hey, what's going on, guys? This Saturday is UFC 300, Alex Pereira versus Jamahal Hill, and there's been a lot of discussion. Is this the greatest UFC fight card of all time? I'm going to answer the question by grading the pay-per-view. I'm going to go through every fight on the pay-per-view main card, briefly discuss each fight, and at the end of the video, I'm going to grade UFC 300 on a scale from 1 to 10, 10 being the greatest pay-per-view of all time, 1 being the worst pay-per-view of all time, which we all know it's obviously not that. And I'm going to answer the question whether or not you should order UFC 300, which, spoiler alert, the answer is yes. And I'm also going to discuss comparisons to UFC 299 as well. Now, before I get into anything, check out the full pay-per-view main card and then comment down below on a scale from 1 to 10, what would you give UFC 300? And also, probably towards the end of the video, we'll discuss some of the prelims on UFC 300 as well, just because, I mean, seriously, this card is unbelievably stacked, but we'll talk about that later in the video. Before I actually talk about any fight on this card, how do I grade a pay-per-view card? I do this for every single pay-per-view. Basically, there's 3 factors in no particular order that I really look at. One is the importance of the fight. Is it a title fight? Is it a #1 contender fight? Next, is it a stylistic, fun, fan-friendly matchup? And lastly, the skill level of each fighter. Are they bottom of the barrel? Are they the elite of the elite? Those are the 3 most important factors I look at when kind of analyzing each one of these fights and kind of discussing how good it is and does it belong on a pay-per-view card, which obviously UFC 300, you know, there's some questionable bout order decisions, but we'll talk about that in a second. Starting off with the very first fight opening up the pay-per-view main card, and that is Bo Nickal versus Cody Brundage, or otherwise known as Cody Brundage. I'm going to be honest, this takes a hit to UFC 300. Right off the bat, it takes a hit because this is the worst fight on the card. This is the worst fight on the card. I challenge anyone to debate me. What is a worse fight on UFC 300 than Bo Nickal versus Cody Brundage? I think people would say Jessica Andrade, Marina Rodriguez, but I think Jessica Andrade, Marina Rodriguez is much better than Bo Nickal versus Cody Brundage. This fight, it has some importance because if Bo Nickal loses this fight, I mean, his career is over before it even started. You lose to Cody Brundage and your career is over. But at the end of the day, it's like Bo Nickal, you know, I understand people always say, Joey, who do you expect him to fight? I understand he's 5-0. I understand this is kind of like a natural progression up the ladder, but this isn't a natural progression type fighter. Bo Nickal is the definition of the hold me back guy. He's, oh yeah, I would destroy Khamzat Chimaev. I would destroy Israel Adesanya. I would destroy this guy. I would destroy that guy. And then he's like, you know what? Give me Cody Brundage on UFC 300. This fight does not belong on the pay-per-view main card. If Bo Nickal was actually getting a decent step up in competition, it could be forgivable. But when you have other prelims, Yuri Prochazka, Alexander Rakic, Aljamain Sterling, Calvin Kattar, Jalen Turner, Renato Moicano, Cody Garbrandt, Davison Figueiredo, literally every single prelim deserves to be on the main card more than this fight. It's just a massive hit to the UFC 300 pay-per-view main card. All to give this, you know, I don't know, aura to Bo Nickal. That's essentially it. You know, he's fighting grocery store cashiers. Now maybe he's going to an assistant manager. Honestly, I said assistant manager the other day. I think it's probably assistant manager in training. Honestly, I don't even think Bo, you know, a fight for Bo Nickal against Cody Brundage is even that big of a step up. And I just don't think this fight's super competitive. I mean, it's somewhat meaningful. And Bo Nickal is very promising, but we don't know how good he is just yet. So I'm interested in this fight. I would laugh hysterically if Cody Brundage was able to go out there and Batista bomb Bo Nickal, and then I would be proven wrong, but I would love to be proven wrong on this one. But overall, I just think this fight deserves to be on the prelims. There was talk for a while that this was going to be opening up the prelims, and that's where it should have been. So, you know, that's the end of my main card complaints for the most part for UFC 300. Let's move up to the next fight, which honestly could headline a pay-per-view for me personally, and I would still buy a pay-per-view, and that is Charles Oliveira versus Arman Tsarukyan. What a banger lightweight fight. 2 top 5 ranked lightweights. A fight that truly should determine the #1 contender in the lightweight division. The winner of Oliveira versus Tsarukyan at UFC 300 should undoubtedly be taking on Islam Makhachev next. Whether that actually happens or not, that remains to be seen because, you know, timing and whatnot. Islam wants to fight in June. But, I mean, this is the best fight on the card, in my opinion. This is better than the main event. I absolutely love this fight. Charles Oliveira has been around forever. He is one of the most exciting fighters on the UFC roster. He is must watch. And honestly, he was starting to become a star a bit. I still think he is a little bit of a star. You know, in the UFC, not even a little bit of a star. I think he's one of those like low to almost creeping up to like a mid-tier drawing power in the UFC. I know the term star has been perverted by the MMA community. I'm not saying he sells 1 million pay-per-view buys like Conor McGregor, but Charles Oliveira is one of those guys who draws in a decent amount of people to watch. And, you know, this is one of those fights where, you know, he's kind of being counted out. He got counted out against Beneil Dariush, and he's fighting a guy in Arman Tsarukyan who's young, hungry, and I believe one of the toughest fights in the division. If you told me right now, somebody in the top 5 defeats Islam Makhachev in the near future, I would pick Arman Tsarukyan. So you have a former champion in Charles Oliveira, a guy who's been around forever, a known finisher, one of the most exciting fighters on the roster, taking on an young up-and-comer like Arman Tsarukyan, 27 years old. This is a banger matchup. I mean, first off, both guys, elite of the elite. Charles Oliveira's striking has improved vastly over the years. He has nasty KO power. He's amazing in the clinch. His BJJ and submission skills are unbelievable. His ability to take damage is unbelievable. Then you have Arman, who I know he hasn't fought, you know, the toughest level of opposition. The best fighter that he's beaten is Beneil Dariush, but he went out there and starched Beneil Dariush. And Arman has unbelievable defensive grappling. He has nasty power. He has nasty ground and pound. He has good jiu-jitsu as well. And he's still getting better. He's only 27 years old. So this matchup on paper is one of the best fights I think the UFC could put together. And I'm so excited for this matchup. Honestly, this is the people's main event. In my opinion, this is the people's main event. I think this is the best fight on the card. I cannot wait. There's so much on the line with this fight because whoever wins this fight is going to be in line for a title shot. Even if they don't fight Islam in June, they will most likely take on Islam in October when he defends his belt potentially on that Abu Dhabi pay-per-view as long as he's ready to go, which I'm assuming he will be, but you never know what could happen in June. He could lose his title depending on who he fights. But either way, the winner of this fight will be in line for a lightweight title shot. So this fight is massive. This fight is crazy. I can't believe at one point this was placed actually underneath Bo Nickel versus Cody Bumdage, which was an absolute atrocity. Shout out to the UFC. People always like, Joey, you complain about the UFC. Shout out to the UFC for hearing criticisms and making a change, because while I'm still not happy Bo Nickel versus Cody Bumdage is on the card, the fact that it was above Charles Oliveira, Arman Tsarukyan was an absolute disgrace, and I'm glad they rectified that, because now we're just getting straight banger after banger after banger. I know the prelims are amazing, but on the main card after that Bo Nickel fight, it's straight banger after banger after banger. It's one of the greatest fight cards of all time. I cannot wait for Charles Oliveira versus Arman Tsarukyan. Moving up on the card to the featured fight on the main card, Justin Gaethje versus Max Holloway for the BMF title. I know I said my complaints were over, and I don't want to spend too much time on it because this card, you know, is great, but I hate the BMF title. But you know, I've kind of been convincing myself now. I actually like the BMF title for this fight because it makes it 5 rounds. If you're going to make Justin Gaethje versus Max Holloway, it has to be a 5-rounder. I'm actually disappointed Charles Oliveira versus Arman Tsarukyan isn't a 5-rounder. So in a way, I'm happy of the BMF title because that makes Gaethje versus Holloway a 5-round fight. Now, ultimately, do I love this matchup? Is this the greatest matchup of all time? No, I think there could have been better fights for each guy. But at the end of the day, you have one of the top lightweights in the world in Justin Gaethje. I believe he's ranked like number 2 right now in the UFC official rankings, somewhere along the lines of something. He's in the top 5 for sure. And then you have Max Holloway, who I definitely know is ranked number 2 behind Volkanovski in the featherweight rankings. And you have 2 guys who have been on the top for a long time. And when I say the top, you guys understand what I mean. Obviously, they're not champions right now. Well, I guess technically Justin Gaethje is a WWE champion in a way. But Max Holloway, one of the featherweight GOATs, former featherweight champion, one of the most exciting fighters on the roster versus Justin Gaethje, former interim lightweight champion and one of the most exciting fighters on the roster. At the end of the day, even though I don't love the matchup, even though I don't love the gimmick belt, if you take two of the best fighters in the world, okay, two of the most exciting fighters in the world, and you put them against each other and you make it a 5-rounder, because I'm king of complaining about fights that aren't 5 rounds. I wanted Khamzat versus Burns to be 5 rounds. There's countless fights that I've said, I wish this fight was 5 rounds. I'm happy that this is 5 rounds. It's two of the elite and two of the most exciting fighters in the world. And on top of that, it's super important in the lightweight division. Again, that June title shot against Islam Makhachev is basically up for grabs. And whoever gets a big win at UFC 300, if they're ready to compete in June, they will get a title shot against Islam Makhachev. So whether it's Charles Oliveira, Arman Tsarukyan, Justin Gaethje, or Max Holloway, if they get a big win at 300 and they're available, obviously I think first priority will be Oliveira and Tsarukyan. I could be wrong, but chances of one of those guys who wins may not be ready for June. That's a quick turnaround. The winner of Gaethje versus Holloway could be ready for that fight. So this fight has massive implications in the lightweight division. It's two of the most elite fighters on the roster and two of the most exciting fighters on the roster. So while I don't love the matchup, I'm really looking forward to it. And it's still a banger fight. And honestly, to be honest, in another universe, the UFC could have main evented a card. They main evented Justin Gaethje, Dustin Poirier BMF title last year. They could have done Justin Gaethje, Max Holloway on another pay-per-view card as a main event. I think there would have been some gripes, reasonably so, but at the end of the day, this is a great fight for a featured fight on a card. Justin Gaethje, Max Holloway featured fight, that's straight up insanity. Again, while I don't love this fight, I'm coming around to it, I'm warming up to it, and I think it's more of my fandom for Max Holloway and wanting to see him in the featherweight division more than anything else in this matchup. But at the end of the day, I'm still really looking forward to it. And I'm sure right before, as Bruce Buffer's announcing their names, I will be hyped for this fight. Moving up on the card to the co-main event, we have Weili Zhang versus Yan Xiaonan for the UFC strawweight title. I know there's been a bit of complaints about this fight, and I kind of get it. Because it is UFC 300, but at the end of the day, I mean, this card's so stacked, and I think this is a banger matchup. I like the women's strawweight division. I understand all the women's divisions don't have the deepest talent pool. They're not as deep as a lot of the men's divisions. But the strawweight division, in my opinion, is the best women's division in the UFC, and Weili Zhang versus Yan Xiaonan is a matchup that we've been waiting for a while. It makes perfect sense, and Yan Xiaonan has shown massive improvement. She's improved vastly over the last few fights. And at the end of the day, the biggest thing about a Weili Zhang fight, at least in my opinion, is the perceived level of threat. And with her coming off a KO win against Jessica Andrade, a win against Mackenzie Dern where she showed off improved grappling. And then before that, I mean, she lost to Marina Rodriguez, but it was split decision, and it was a close fight, and some people even thought she won that fight. Her last loss that you're really looking at where she got dominated is against Carla Esparza back in 2021. That's 3 years ago now. As crazy as that is, how is it 2024 already? So you have Yan Xiaonan coming in as a challenger against Weili Zhang, who's looked incredible, dominated, it's a bit of an exaggeration, but really dominated Amanda Lemos in her last fight, dominated her with the grappling, which is Yan Xiaonan's one of her biggest weaknesses. But also Weili Zhang's an elite level kickboxer as well. Nasty on the feet, nasty in the clinch. I'm very curious, if Yan Xiaonan can stuff the takedowns, and I wish Weili Zhang wouldn't grapple almost. Because if Weili Zhang doesn't grapple that much, but I believe she will grapple, I believe she will mix in the takedowns. Obviously, it's in her arsenal. It's Yan Xiaonan's biggest weakness. Why wouldn't she? On the feet, I think this could be one of the greatest women's fights of all time. Now, obviously, I think Weili Zhang's going to mix in the takedowns, but imagine Yan Xiaonan starts stuffing some of those takedowns. Weili Zhang has improved her wrestling substantially. She showed it in her last 2 fights, really, against Amanda Lemos and against Carla Esparza. But if Yan can stuff those takedowns, that's going to make for a massive, kind of test for Weili Zhang on the feet, because Yan Xiaonan, I think, might even have the edge in the striking. I know that's crazy to say, but might even have the edge in the striking. But at the end of the day, this is for the strawweight title. This is two of the elite in the women's strawweight division, and also it's two exciting women's fighters. A lot of people complain, women's fighters boring, this and that. And I do get it to a certain extent, but I think a lot of people are kind of misconstruing it. It's just low-level women's MMA a lot of the time that we're complaining about. And when it's low-level women's MMA, it becomes boring because it just doesn't look all that aesthetically pleasing. Meanwhile, we have a lot of low-level men's MMA as well. So either way, I think this is a good co-main event. I think it got too much hate from the beginning when it was announced. and I'm looking forward to Wei Li Zhang versus Yan Xiaonan. Moving up on the card, the main event, we have Alex Pereira versus Jamahal Hill. I'm hyped for this fight. I'm hyped. If I wasn't a little bit worried about Jamahal Hill maybe coming back too quickly from the Achilles heel tear, I mean, my hype level for this fight would be through the roof. The only thing that's kind of tempered it a little bit is Jamahal Hill's questionable returning a little bit too quickly. But at the end of the day, I mean, this is an amazing light heavyweight title fight where you have Alex Pereira defending a belt that Jamahal Hill never lost. Jamahal Hill beat Glover Teixeira, who was a friend and coach of Alex Pereira. Beat the brakes off of him, retired Glover Teixeira. And you even had Jamahal Hill and Alex Pereira looking at each other at the time. And Alex Pereira was the middleweight champion at the time. And now, a year and a half later, or, about a year and a half later, it was January of last year, they are facing off for the light heavyweight title. And it's a stylistically fan-friendly fight. I mean, Jamahal Hill says he's not going to grapple. I think he'll mix it in a little bit. But at the end of the day, Alex Pereira's striking is some of the most aesthetically pleasing elite-level striking we've seen in the UFC. Obviously, longtime pro kickboxer. And then you have Jamahal Hill, whose striking has improved vastly over the course of his UFC career since the days of Dana White's Contender Series. And stylistically, this is just such a fun matchup on paper. It has a decent storyline, which I really haven't seen talked about all that much. The fact that Jamahal Hill beat up his coach and friend Glover Teixeira to win the title to begin with. And then also, you have the built-in storyline of Jamahal Hill returning from a catastrophic injury, a long layoff. Jamahal Hill, I thought it was a great moment in MMA when Jamahal Hill was, embracing his coaches after he won the title against Glover Teixeira, and he was kind of crying in the cage, and he had realized his dream, only to have that ripped away by a catastrophic Achilles tear. And I think it'll be very interesting to see if he can earn that title back against Alex Pereira. He relinquished it because he was going to be out for a while, and now he's going to come back and try to regain that title against Alex Pereira. I mean, this matchup has it all, and I honestly don't feel like the comeback story from Jamahal Hill, nor the kind of little bit of a storyline of the Glover Teixeira win. I don't feel like anyone's really talked about that too much. I feel like the gravity of UFC 300 has kind of, I feel like it has overshadowed any one fight on the card. I really feel like it's overshadowed any one fight because you just hear UFC 300, UFC 300, UFC 300, and how stacked the card is, which I absolutely love. I'm not complaining about this. But I feel like it's overshadowed the fights in a way. It's weird. If you know what I'm talking about, please let me know down in the comments if that makes sense. But this main event has so much on the line. The light heavyweight title, one of the most prestigious titles. The light heavyweight division for the longest time was like one of the most popular divisions in the UFC. And it was run by John Jones for many years. Then he left and there was kind of a curse, and there still seems to be a curse. But maybe Alex Pereira is the guy to break the curse. He hasn't relinquished the belt due to an injury. You had Yuri Prochazka win the title, relinquish it due to injury. Jamahal Hill win the title, relinquish it due to injury. Alex Pereira, it seems like he's going to defend his title at UFC 300, knock on wood. I love this matchup. Stylistically, it's amazing. Skill for skill, it's amazing. Both these guys are the elite of the elite. And, what I really love about fights, certain fights, when I feel like, this fight could truly go either way. And that's kind of what I feel about like Alex Pereira versus Jamahal Hill. I feel the same way about Charles Oliveira, Arman Tsarukyan. Now, do I have certain confidence in certain outcomes? Yes. Obviously, I talk about them in my full card prediction videos, which I encourage you to go check out. We'll link down in the description as well as the end cards. But I absolutely love Pereira versus Jamahal Hill. And honestly, either guy could win. And either guy at light heavyweight, especially with the KO power of both these guys, either guy could get slept. You zig when you should have zagged. You can easily get slept by a nasty KO counter or, whatever it may be, a nasty head kick from Jamahal Hill, even like he was slamming against Glover Teixeira. And, I just love this main event. Now, as far as a grade for UFC 300, I'm usually only grade the main card. And that's what I'll stick to at first. But then I'm going to get into something a little bit different. For the main card overall, I think it's a straight up banger, but I feel like Bo Nickel, Cody Bumdage knocks some off. So let's say I was going to give, I'm never going to give a 10, but let's say I was going to give UFC 300 main card a 9.8. That's not my grade. Let's say I was going to give it a 9.8. I feel like I have to knock off a point for, Bo Nickel versus Cody Bumdage being on the main card. And then on top of that, and I know people are going to think I'm crazy, and I usually never care about stuff like this, but then you have the UFC 300 poster, which is an absolute disgrace, and it's absolute disturbing, and it's disgusting, and it's hideous, and it's ugly, and it's one of the worst posters I've ever seen in the history of UFC. I feel like I have to knock off a little bit more, so maybe I'd knock it down to an 8.5 now. You know, I knocked off a point from 9.8, now it's an 8.8. I'll knock it down another 0.3 to an 8.5. But if I'm going to take in these different things, I guess I have to take into account, which I usually don't, the prelims. I mean, you look at the prelims, Yuri Prochazka, Alexander Rakic, top light heavyweight fight. Could be a #1 contender fight. Then you have Calvin Kattar, Aljamain Sterling, which is an amazing featherweight matchup. Very interesting to see Aljamain Sterling return. Then you have Holly Holm, Kayla Harrison. It's going to be interesting to see if Kayla Harrison makes 135 pounds. This is arguably a #1 contender fight, at least for Kayla Harrison. Then you have Sadiq Youssef versus Diego Lopez. Diego Lopez, one of the most exciting fighters on the roster, getting a big jump up in competition since his short notice debut against Movsar Evloev. Now he's fighting Sadiq Youssef. Then you have Jalen Turner, Renato Moicano, Jessica Andrade, Marina Rodriguez, Bobby Green, Jim Miller. Davison Figueiredo versus Cody Garbrandt is opening up the main card. So while I normally don't take into account the prelims when grading a card, if I'm taking into account the fact that you have that ugly poster and, you know, okay, I should take into account Bo Nickel versus Cody Bumdage is on the main card. But let's say you shifted it and you put Yuri versus Rakic on the main card, and I'm going to account for all the prelims. I'm going to say UFC 300 is a 9.5 out of 10. I think this is the greatest UFC pay-per-view on paper ever in the history of the sport. Now, I've been watching since 2010. I've been a hardcore fan since 2010 on paper, because obviously you can't, if you're a fan in the last couple of years, you can't look back at other pay-per-views and understand how good they were at the time. You know, there's certain fights that you're like, oh, I never heard of them, so it doesn't matter. But at the time, it mattered. So, at least I can look back to 2010. I can't say previous to that, but since 2010, undoubtedly on paper, UFC 300 is the greatest pay-per-view on paper of all time that the UFC has ever put together. It has the deepest amount of talent. It has the deepest amount of amazing matchups, and I absolutely cannot wait for UFC 300, and that's why I'm giving it a 9.5. I'll be live streaming the full card on Saturday night, so make sure to join me, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, like the video. Let me know what you think of my grade down in the comments, and that's it. I'll see you guys in the next video. Thank you so much for watching.